Okay. Because it is a different vibe, right? He's talking about a different kind of nightlife, a different kind of energy that's in the city that he's currently living in. So let's keep reading. But when I got off the train and came back to my hood, to my Flatbush Avenue or my Harlem, the fear still held. It was the same boys with the same bop, the same ice grill, and the same code I'd known all my life. If there was one difference in New York, it was that we had more high yellow cousins here in the Puerto Ricans and Dominicans. But their rituals were so similar, the way they walked and gave dap, it was all familiar to me. And so I found myself on any given day traveling through several New Yorks at once. Dynamic, brutal, moneyed, sometimes all of those at once. Perhaps you remember that time we went to see Howl's Moving Castle on the Upper West Side. You were almost 5 years old. The theater was crowded. And when we came out, we rode a set of escalators down to the ground floor. As we came off, you were moving at the dawdling speed of a small child. A white woman pushed you and said, "Come on." Many things now happened at once. There was the reaction of any parent when a stranger lays a hand on the body of his child. And there was my own insecurity in my ability to protect your black body. And more, there was my sense that this woman was pulling rank. I knew, for instance, that she would not have pushed a black child out on my part of Flatbush because she would be afraid there and would sense, if not know, that there would be a penalty for such an action. But I was not out on my part of Flatbush, and I was not in West Baltimore, and I was far from the Mecca. I forgot all of that. I was only aware that someone had invoked their right over the body of my son. I turned and spoke to this woman, and my words were hot with all of the moment and all of my history. She shrunk back, shocked. A white man standing nearby spoke up in her defense. I experienced this as his attempt to rescue the damsel from the beast. He had made no such attempt on behalf of my son, and he was now supported by other white people in the assembling crowd. The man came closer. He grew louder. I pushed him away. He said, I could have you arrested. I did not care. I told him this, and the desire to do much more was hot in my throat. This desire was only controllable because I remembered someone standing off to the side there, bearing witness to more fury than he had ever seen from me. You. I came home shook. It was a mix of shame for having gone back to the law of the streets mixed with rage. I could have you arrested, which is to say, I could take your body. I've told this story many times, not out of bravado, but out of a need for absolution. I've never been a violent person. Even when I was young and adopted the rules of the street, anyone who knew me knew it was a bad fit. I've never felt the pride that is supposed to come with righteous self-defense and justified violence. Whenever it was me on top of someone, whenever my rage in the moment, afterward I always felt sick at having been lowered to the crudest form of communication. Malcolm made sense to me not out of a love of violence, but because nothing in my life prepared me to understand tear gas or as deliverance, as those Black History Month martyrs of the civil rights movement did. But more than any shame I feel about my own actual violence, my greatest regret was that in seeking to defend you, I was in fact endangering you. I could have you arrested, he said, which is to say, one of your son's earliest memories will be watching the men who sodomized Abner Louima and choked Anthony Baez, cuff, club, tase, and break you. I had forgotten the rules, an era as dangerous on the Upper West Side of Manhattan as on the West Side of Baltimore. One must without error out here. One must be without error out here. Walk in single file, work quietly, pack an extra number 2 pencil, make no mistakes. But you are human and you will make mistakes. You will misjudge, you will yell, you will drink too much, you will hang out with people you shouldn't. Not all of us can always be Jackie Robinson. Not even Jackie Robinson was always Jackie Robinson. But the price of error is higher for you than it is for your countrymen. And so that America might justify itself, the story of a black body's destruction must always begin with his or her era, real or imagined. With Eric Garner's anger, with Trayvon Martin's mystical words, "You're gonna die tonight," with Sean Bell's mistake of running with the wrong crowd, with me standing too close to the small-eyed boy pulling out. A society almost necessarily begins every success story with the chapter that most advantages itself. And in America, these precipitating chapters are almost always rendered as the singular action of exceptional individuals. It only takes one person to make a change, you are often told. This is also a myth. Perhaps one person can make a change, but not the kind of change that would raise your body to equality with your countrymen. The fact of history is that black people have not, probably no people have ever, liberated themselves strictly through their own efforts. In every great change in the lives of African Americans, we see the hand of events that were beyond our individual control. Events that were not unalloyed goods. You cannot disconnect our emancipation in the northern colonies from the blood spilled in the Revolutionary War, any more than you could disconnect our emancipation from slavery in the South from the charnel houses of the Civil War, any more than you can disconnect our emancipation from Jim Crow from the genocides of the Second World War. History is not solely in our hands, and still you are called to struggle, not because it assures you victory, but because it assures you an honorable and sane life. I'm ashamed of how I acted that day, ashamed of endangering your body, but I am not ashamed because I am a bad father, a bad individual, or ill-mannered. I am ashamed that I made an error, knowing that our error always costs us more. This is the import of the history all around us, though very few people like to think about it. Had I informed this woman that when she pushed my son, she was acting according to a tradition that held black bodies as lesser, her response would likely have been, I am not a racist, or maybe not. But my experience in this world has been that the people who believe themselves to be white are obsessed with the politics of personal exoneration. And the word racist to them conjures, if not a tobacco-spitting oath, then something just as fantastic, an orc, troll, or gorgon. I'm not a racist, an entertainer once insisted after being filmed repeatedly yelling at a heckler, he's a nigger, he's a nigger. Considering segregationist Senator Strom Thurmond, Richard Nixon concluded, Strom is no racist. There are no racists in America, or at least none that the people who need to be white know personally. In the era of mass lynching, it was so difficult to find who specifically served as executioner that such deaths were often reported by the press as having happened at the hands of persons unknown. In 1957, the white residents of Levittown, Pennsylvania, argued for their right to keep their town segregated. As moral, religious, and law-abiding citizens, the group wrote, we feel that we are unprejudiced and undiscriminating in our wish to keep our community a closed community. This was the attempt to commit a shameful act while escaping all sanction, and I raise it to show you that there was no golden era when evildoers did their business and loudly proclaimed it as such. We would prefer to say that such people cannot exist, that there aren't any. To do evil, a human being must first of all believe that what he's doing is good, or else that it's all a well-considered act in conformity with natural law. This is the foundation of the dream. Its adherents must not just believe in it, but believe that it is just. Believe that their possession of the dream is the natural result of grit, honor, and good works. There is some passing acknowledgement of the bad old days, which, by the way, were not so bad as to have an ongoing effect on our present. The mettle that it takes to look away from the horror of our prison system, from police forces transformed into armies, from the long war against the black body is not forged overnight. This is the practice habit of jabbing out one's eyes and forgetting the work of one's hands. To acknowledge these horrors means turning away from the brightly rendered version of your country as it has always declared itself and turning towards something murkier and unknown. It is still too difficult for most Americans to do this, but that is your work. It must be, if only to preserve the sanctity of your mind. So what is Ta-Nehisi alluding to? He's alluding to the fact that if you're going to have the American dream, for some people, part of that dream is to actually act like America came into its own, came into its existence without all of the other atrocities committed against other people groups. And we see this today Just even in the commentary that we see in the media, even in the videos that we've seen from certain people, some people really believe that this country is great simply because of white people. Some people believe that this country, there was one gentleman on television, a white supremacist. He actually believes that America was created by white people without the help, without the blood, sweat, tears, without the struggle from anyone else. I mean, you have to be really, 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 what's the word? Delusional, right? To think that this country came into being without the help of Black Americans, the Japanese, the Chinese, the Native Americans who are already here. So, as he said, it takes lots of courage to believe in the American dream while ignoring all of the things that happen in this country to bring about the American dream, right? So, let's keep reading and see what he says. This is our last section for today. The entire narrative of this country argues against the truth of who you are. I think of that summer that you may well remember when I loaded you and your cousin Christopher into the back seat of a rented car and pushed you out to see what remained of Petersburg, Shirley Plantation, and the wilderness. I was obsessed with the Civil War because 600,000 people had died in it, and yet it had been glossed over in my education and in popular culture. Representations of the war and its reasons seemed obscured. And yet I knew that in 1859 we were enslaved, and in 1865 we were not. And what happened to us in those years struck me as having some amount of import. But whenever I visited any of the battlefields, I felt like I was greeted as if I were a nosy accountant conducting an audit and someone was trying to hide the books. I don't know if you remember how the film we saw at the Petersburg battlefield ended, as though the fall of the Confederacy were the onset of a tragedy, not a jubilee. I doubt you remember the man on our tour dressed in the gray wool of the Confederacy, or how every visitor seemed interested in flanking maneuvers, hardtack, smoothbore rifles, grape shoot, and ironclads, but virtually no one was interested in what all of this engineering, invention, and design had been marshaled to achieve. You were only 10 years old. But even then I knew that I must trouble you, and this meant taking you into rooms where people would insult your intelligence, where thieves would try to enlist you in your own robbery and disguise their burning and looting as Christian charity. But robbery is what this is, what it always was. At the onset of the Civil War, our stolen bodies were worth $4 billion, more than all of American industry and all of American railroads, workshops, and factories combined. And the prime product rendered by our stolen bodies was cotton. It was America's primary export. The richest men in America lived in the Mississippi River Valley, and they made their riches off our stolen bodies. Our bodies were held in bondage by the early presidents. Our bodies were traded from the White House by James K. Polk. Our bodies built the Capitol and the National Mall. The first shot of the Civil War was fired in South Carolina, where our bodies constituted the majority of human bodies in the state. Here is the motive for the Great War. It's not a secret. But we can do better and find the bandit confessing his crime. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, declared Mississippi as it left the Union, the greatest material interest of the world. Do you remember standing with me and your mother during one of our visits to Gettysburg, outside the home of Abraham Bryan? We were with a young man who'd educated himself on the history of black people in Gettysburg. He explained that Bryan Farm was the far end of the line that was charged by George Pickett on the final day of Gettysburg. He told us that Bryan was a black man, that Gettysburg was home to a free black community, that Bryan and his family fled their home for fear of losing their bodies to the advancing army of enslavement. Led by the honored and holy Confederate General Robert E. Lee, whose army was then stealing black people from themselves and selling them south. George Pickett and his troops were repulsed by the Union Army. Standing there a century and a half later, I thought of one of Faulkner's characters, famously recalling how his failure tantalized the minds of all Southern boys. It's all in the balance. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't even begun. All of Faulkner's Southern boys were white, but I, standing on the farm of a black man who fled with his family to stay free of the South, saw picket soldiers charging through history in wild pursuit of their strange birthright, the right to beat, rape, rob, pillage the black body. That is all of what was in the balance, the nostalgic moment's corrupt and unspeakable core. But American Reunion was built on a comfortable narrative that made enslavement into benevolence, white knights of body snatchers, and the mass slaughter of the war into a kind of sport in which one could conclude that both sides conducted their affairs with courage, honor, and elan. This lie of the Civil War is the lie of innocence. It is the dream. Historians conjured the dream. Hollywood fortified the dream. The dream was gilded by novels and adventure stories. John Carter flees the broken Confederacy from Mars. We are not supposed to ask what precisely he was running from. I, like every kid I knew, loved the Dukes of Hazzard, but I would have done well to think more about why two outlaws driving a car named General Lee must necessarily be portrayed as just some good old boys, never meaning no harm. A mantra for the dreamers, if ever there was one. But what one means is neither important nor relevant. It is not necessary that you believe that the officer who choked Eric Garner set out that day to destroy a body. All you need to understand is that the officer carries within him the power of the American state and the weight of an American legacy, and they necessitate that of the bodies destroyed every year, some wild and disproportionate number of them will be black. Here's what I would like for you to know. In America, it is traditional to destroy the black body. It is heritage. Enslavement was not merely the antiseptic borrowing of labor. It is not so easy to get a human being to commit their body against its own elemental interest. And so enslavement must be casual wrath and random manglings, the gashing of heads and brains blown out over the river as the body seeks to escape. It must be rape so regular as to be industrial. There is no uplifting way to say this. I have no praise anthems nor old Negro spirituals. The spirit and soul are the body and brain, which are destructible. That is precisely why they were so precious. And the soul did not escape. The spirit did not steal away on gospel wings. The soul was the body that fed the tobacco, and the spirit was the blood that watered the cotton. And these created the first fruits of the American garden. And the fruits were secured through the bashing of children with stove wood, through hot iron peeling skin away like husk from corn. It had to be blood. It had to be nails driven through tongues and ears pruned away. Some disobedience, wrote a Southern mistress. Much idleness, sullenness, slovenness used the rod. It had to be the thrashing of kitchen hands for the crime of churning butter at a leisurely clip. It had to be some woman cheered with 30 lashes, a Saturday last, and as many more a Tuesday again. It could only be the employment of carriage whips, tongs, iron pokers, hand saws, stones, paperweights, or whatever might be handy to break the black body, the black family, the black community, the black nation. The bodies were pulverized into stock and marked with insurance. And the bodies were an aspiration, lucrative as Indian land, a veranda, a beautiful wife, or a summer home in the mountains. For the men who needed to believe themselves white, the bodies were the key to a social club, and the right to break the bodies was the mark of civilization. The two great divisions of society are not the rich and the poor, but white and black, said the great South Carolina Senator John C. Calhoun. All the former and the poor, as well as the rich, belong to the upper class and are respected and treated as equals. And there it is, the right to break the black body as the meaning of their sacred equality. And that right has always given them meaning, has always meant that there was someone down in the valley, because a mountain is not a mountain if there is nothing below. You and I, my son, are that below. That was true in 1776. It is true today. There is no them without you, and without the right to break you, they must necessarily fall from the mountain, lose their divinity, and tumble out of the dream. And then they would have to determine how to build their suburbs or something other than human bones, how to angle their jails towards something other than a human stockyard, how to erect a democracy independent of cannibalism, but because they believe themselves to be white, they would rather countenance a man choked to death on film under their laws. And they would rather subscribe to the myth of Trayvon Martin, slight teenager, hands full of candy and soft drinks, transforming into a murderous juggernaut. And they would rather see Prince Jones followed by a bad cop through 3 jurisdictions and shot down for acting like a human. And they would rather reach out in all their sanity and push my 4-year-old son as though he were merely an obstacle in the path of their too important day. I was there, Samori. No, I was back in Baltimore surrounded by them boys. I was on my parents' living room floor staring out at that distant world impenetrable to me. I was in all the anger of my years. I was where Eric Garner must have been in his last moments. This stops today, he said, and was killed. I felt the cosmic injustice, even though I did not fully understand it. I had not yet been to Gettysburg. I had not yet read the Lovia Glimpse. All I had was the feeling and the weight. I did not yet know, and I do not fully know now. But part of what I know is that there is the burden of living among dreamers, and there's the extra burden of your country telling you the dream is just, noble, and real, and you are crazy for seeing the corruption and smelling the sulfur. For their innocence, they nullify your anger, your fear, until you are coming and going. And you find yourself inveighing against yourself. Black people are the only people who ... Really inveighing against your own humanity and raging against the crime in your ghetto because you are powerless before the great crime of history that brought the ghettos to be. It is truly horrible to understand yourself as the essential below of your country. It breaks too much of what we would like to think about ourselves, our lives, the worlds we move through, and the people who surround us. The struggle to understand is our only advantage over this madness. By the time I visited those battlefields, I knew that they had been retrofitted as the staging ground for a great deception. And this was my only security, because they could no longer insult me by lying to me. I knew, and the most important thing I knew was that somewhere deep within, they knew it too. I like to think that knowing might have kept me from endangering you, that having understood and acknowledged the anger, I could control it. I like to think that it could have allowed me to speak the needed words to the woman and then walk away. I like to think this, but I can't promise it. The struggle is really all I have for you because it is the only portion of this world under your control. I am sorry that I cannot make it okay. I am sorry that I cannot save you, but not that sorry. Part of me thinks that your very vulnerability brings you closer to the meaning of life, just as for others the quest to believe oneself white divides them from it. The fact is that despite their dreams, their lives are also not inviolable. When their own vulnerability becomes real, when the police decide that tactics intended for the ghetto should enjoy wider usage, when their armed society shoots down their children, when nature sends hurricanes against their cities, they are shocked in a way that those of us who were born and bred to understand cause and effect can never be. And I would not have you live like that. You've been cast into a race in which the wind is always at your face and the hounds are always at your heels. And to varying degrees, this is true of all life. The difference is that you do not have the privilege of living in ignorance and this essential fact. I'm speaking to you as I always have, as the sober and serious man I've always wanted you to be, who does not apologize for his human feelings, who does not make excuses for his height, his long arms, his beautiful smile. You are growing into consciousness, and my wish for you is that you feel no need to constrict yourself to make other people feel comfortable. None of that can change the math anyway. I never wanted you to be twice as good as them, so much as I've always wanted you to attack every day of your brief, bright life in struggle. The people who must believe that they are white can never be your measuring stick. I would not have you descend into your own dream. I would have you be a conscious citizen of this terrible and beautiful world. Wow. Give me just 1 second.